My husband stood in front of 600 people and let a woman who had been sleeping with him for 11 months take a bow for a company my mother built with her own 2 hands. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to walk out the side exit, past the coat check, past the valet stand, and disappear quietly into a town car, the way a woman is supposed to disappear when she has been humiliated in public. That was the version of me he had spent 9 years constructing. Quiet, grateful, easy to talk over in interviews. What he didn't know was that my clutch bag, small and beaded and utterly unremarkable, was not holding a lipstick or a folded tissue. It was holding the one thing he was actually afraid of: proof. Delphine walked the step and repeat in the exact shade of green I had spent 4 years perfecting. Midnight orchid, we called it internally. The color I had mixed by hand in a cold water walk-up in Queens, back when Ashdown House was 3 sewing machines and a folding table. She smiled at the cameras like she owned the formula, like she'd bled for it. My husband, Weston Ashdown Cole, though he'd dropped the hyphen from his own name the year the company went public, keeping only the half that made him sound like the founder, stood beside her in a black satin lapel, his hand resting low on her back like she was a trophy he'd just been handed. Reporters called her name. Someone asked if Delphine had inspired the new spring line. He smiled into the microphone and said, "Delphine is the muse behind this next era of the house." I was standing 18 feet away in champagne silk with black diamonds sewn along the spine of the dress, and people were watching me the way you watch a building you expect to collapse. A few whispered. A few filmed. Then Weston made it worse. He told the press I had always been good with details, that I'd never had real vision. My own husband, at my own launch, in front of my own name stitched into the invitation. Delphine lowered her eyes like a humble queen. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had sat in my design meetings. She had sat in my fitting room. She had, at one particularly unbearable Tuesday in March, sat in my chair. 3 months before that night, I found her emerald stud earring under my husband's pillow. I didn't scream. I didn't throw it at the wall like the women in the movies. I placed it into a small velvet pouch and labeled it with the date, the way you label evidence, because by then, some part of me already understood that's exactly what it was. That was the first receipt. The second one was worse. My head of pattern making sent me a screenshot after midnight, a leaked draft of a press release. The company was naming Weston and Delphine as the future of Ashdown House. My name had been pushed down to the second paragraph. Not founder, not owner. Brand consultant with creative input. That was the night I stopped trying to save my marriage. That was the night I called the one man Weston genuinely feared. Cassian Voss, a billionaire investor with a reputation for dismantling men who believed themselves untouchable. Cassian didn't comfort me. He didn't tell me I was brave. He opened the folder I handed him at a quiet cafe on the Upper East Side and read it in complete silence for 11 minutes. Then he closed it, looked at me, and said the only sentence I needed to hear. This isn't a divorce anymore. This is an acquisition. After that, I went quiet in a way Weston completely misread. He thought silence meant fear. Delphine thought silence meant weakness. They were both catastrophically wrong. By day, I smiled through fittings, approved fabric swatches, nodded through calls with our licensing partners in Milan. By night, a small, precise team, 2 forensic accountants, a retired federal prosecutor, and a media attorney with a jaw like granite, went through every document Weston had touched in 3 years. We found emails. We found payments routed through a shell company registered in Delaware under a name that meant nothing until you traced the signatory. We found a board resolution with a signature that didn't match any version of my own hand, forged onto a document that quietly diluted my founding shares. We found a string of messages where Delphine called me, in her own words, the sad little seamstress playing founder. I read that line twice. Then I laughed, alone, in my office at 11 at night, because a seamstress knows exactly where to cut. On launch night, under the crystal chandeliers of the Rainbow Room, Weston gave his speech. He thanked the investors. He thanked the press. Then he thanked Delphine for bringing softness and vision to the house. She stepped onto the small stage wearing my color. The room applauded. Not everyone, but enough. Weston looked directly at me when he said, "My wife contributed to some of the early aesthetic." Contributed. That small, careless word almost made me smile. He still believed he was stealing from a woman who didn't hold the keys. Then he turned to Delphine and said, "My love, this is yours." The whole room went still. Nobody could pretend any more. He had humiliated me publicly and handed her the work of an entire lifetime, my mother's lifetime and mine. I lifted one finger. In the AV booth, the technical director pressed play. Weston frowned. "That's not the cue," he said into the microphone, sharp and low. The massive screens behind him went black. The crowd went silent. Delphine stopped smiling. Then the first image appeared, filling the entire ballroom wall. A photograph of a young woman at a sewing machine in a small apartment in Queens, her hair pinned back, her hands steady on the fabric. The caption beneath her face read, "Eleanor Ashdown, 1979. Weston turned toward me so fast the microphone scraped against his lapel. Delphine whispered something to him. He didn't answer. For the first time all night, he looked lost instead of certain. I wasn't angry yet, just unafraid. And that, more than anything else in the room, was the beginning of the end for both of them. The city I grew up loving was not the one printed on postcards. It was the New York of the outer boroughs, the 7 train rattling over Roosevelt Avenue at 6 in the morning, the smell of a bakery that closed before I turned 10, the particular gray light that fell through a 4th-floor window in Sunnyside, where my mother, Eleanor Ashdown, kept a single Singer sewing machine bolted to a card table because she couldn't afford one that stood on its own legs. She stitched other women's names into other women's clothes for 22 years. She altered hems for a department store on 5th Avenue that never once put her name on a label, though half the gowns that walked down that store's runway during Fashion Week had been touched by her hands at 3 in the morning, fixing what some overpaid junior designer had rushed and ruined. She used to say that a good seamstress is invisible by design, and a great one learns to stop being invisible on her own terms. I was 19 when she died. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late because she'd spent 30 years putting her own health behind other people's deadlines. I stood at her funeral in a coat I'd made myself out of the last bolt of black wool she'd bought before she got too sick to sew, and I promised her, silently, the way you promise the dead things you're terrified you won't be able to keep, that her name would mean something before I was done. It took me 11 years, 4 evictions from studio spaces I couldn't afford, 1 catastrophic factory deal in New Jersey that nearly bankrupted me before Ashdown House ever sold a single coat, and 1 very small, very stubborn atelier above a shuttered bakery in Long Island City to build something real. By the time I was 32, Ashdown House had a flagship on Green Street in Soho, a licensing deal with a fragrance house, and a waiting list for our ready-to-wear collection that stretched 8 months long. That was the year I met Weston. He was 36, sharp-suited, effortlessly charming in the specific way that men become when they've spent a career convincing boards of directors to trust them with money that isn't theirs. He worked in brand strategy, the kind of consulting where you fly business class to tell a company things its own employees have been saying for years, but dressed up in language expensive enough to justify the invoice. He came to Ashdown House on a retainer to help us prepare for a Series B raise. He was good at his job. I'll give him that much, even now. He understood how to translate my instincts, the ones I'd absorbed at my mother's elbow, half-conscious, the way you absorb a language before you can name its grammar, into decks that made investors lean forward. He was patient in meetings. He remembered the names of my staff's children. He brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it without ever being told twice. I married him 18 months later in a small ceremony in the Hudson Valley. My mother's photograph propped on the altar in a simple silver frame because I couldn't stand the idea of celebrating anything that mattered without her watching, even from a photograph. I remember the proposal with an almost embarrassing clarity, the way you remember things before you know they'll need re-examining someday. He'd flown me to a small vineyard in the Hudson Valley under the pretense of scouting a location for a lookbook shoot, and when I turned around from admiring a row of old grapevines, he was already on one knee, holding a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I remember thinking, in that specific unguarded way you only allow yourself once or twice in a lifetime, that I had finally found someone who understood both halves of me, the woman who could close a licensing deal and the woman who still cried, every single year, on the anniversary of her mother's death. Our wedding was small by industry standards, 60 guests in a barn upstate strung with the same soft fairy lights we'd later use, without irony, in our first runway show. My mother's photograph sat on the altar in a plain silver frame, and Weston, to his credit, gave a toast that night that mentioned her by name, that acknowledged, publicly, that he understood he was marrying not just me, but the entire weight of what I'd built in her memory. I cried through most of it. I believed every word. For the first 3 years, it was, by any measure I understood at the time, a good marriage. He supported the long nights during collection deadlines, showing up at the atelier at 10 at night with takeout containers, and the specific patience of a man who understood that creative work runs on its own clock. He negotiated our first international distribution deal himself and refused to take a fee for it, calling it an investment in us. I remember believing, with the specific, embarrassing certainty of someone who has never yet been betrayed, that I had built a life immune to the things that destroyed other women's marriages. There were smaller moments, too, that I've turned over so many times since that they've lost some of their original shape, worn smooth like a stone kept too long in a pocket. The way he used to keep a running list on his phone of small details about my mother that I mentioned only once in passing. Her favorite flower, the radio station she used to play in the workshop, the particular way she pinned fabric before cutting it, and would bring them up months later, unprompted, in a way that made me feel deeply, thoroughly known. I understand now that a man capable of that kind of attentiveness is also, by definition, a man capable of studying you closely enough to know exactly which threads to pull later. At the time, I only understood that I felt safe, and safety, once you've spent your whole life without it, is a difficult thing to interrogate. The shift was so slow I can only see it clearly now, in hindsight, the way you can only see a staircase's full descent once you've reached the bottom of it. It started with small corrections in meetings. "What Marlowe means is," he'd say, before I'd finished a sentence, redirecting my own thought back to the room in language he found more palatable. It started with him taking more panels, more interviews, more magazine profiles under the umbrella of brand voice, while I stayed in the atelier fitting muslins at midnight because someone, after all, had to actually make the clothes. It started with him introducing himself, at increasing frequency, as the co-founder of Ashdown House, which was, on paper, technically true. He did hold 20% of the company by then, negotiated during our Series B in a moment I'd been too exhausted and too in love to examine closely. But co-founder is a word that implies you were there at the beginning, sewing labels into your mother's black wool coat with your own trembling hands, and he was not. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a marriage requires generosity, requires letting the person you love take up space, even space that used to be entirely yours. I did not yet understand that generosity, given to the wrong person, is simply a slower form of theft. The city noticed before I did. New York is small in the way that matters. The same 300 people cycle through every gallery opening, every industry dinner, every private view at the Whitney. My longtime publicist, a sharp-eyed woman named Coral Whitfield, who'd been with me since our first tiny showroom, pulled me aside at a dinner 18 months ago and asked, carefully, whether I'd noticed how often Weston was photographed at events I hadn't attended. I told her he was building relationships on my behalf. I told myself the same thing, in the mirror, more times than I'd like to admit. There was a smaller cruelty too, one that took me longer to name because it hid so well behind the language of partnership. Weston had started, somewhere in that second year, referring to my design choices as instinctive, in a tone that made the word sound almost like a diagnosis, while describing his own contributions, largely strategic, largely financial, as vision. I didn't clock it as an insult at first. It took a conversation with an old friend from my very first showroom days, a stylist named Priyanka, who'd known me since before Ashdown House had a proper name, for me to understand what was happening. She visited the studio one afternoon, watched Weston correct me twice in a 20-minute meeting about fabric sourcing, and pulled me aside afterward. "He talks about you the way people talk about weather," she said. "Something that happens to the business, not something that runs it." I laughed it off at the time, told her she was reading too much into an ordinary meeting. I've thought about that sentence more times since than almost anything else anyone said to me that entire year. That was around the time Delphine Rourke joined the company. She came in as a brand consultant, Weston's hire, technically, though he ran it through me with language so smooth, I signed off without questioning it. 31, magnetic, with the specific kind of confidence that reads as talent until you look closely enough to notice it's mostly nerve. She had a good eye, I'll admit that too. She understood Instagram in a way I never fully bothered to learn. She started sitting in on my design reviews within a month. She started sitting in my chair, my actual chair, the worn leather one my mother had reupholstered twice, within 3. I noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself a woman who has clawed a company up from a card table in Sunnyside has no business being threatened by someone 12 years her junior with a good Instagram feed. I was wrong about almost everything that year, but I was never wrong about her. The launch we were building toward, the one that would eventually become the night everything broke open in the Rainbow Room, was meant to be the crowning moment of Ashdown House's decade. A full runway show. Press from 4 continents. The unveiling of a fragrance line my mother had once sketched notes for on a napkin, notes I'd kept in a box for 15 years before finally having the resources to make them real. I should have known something was wrong the week Weston stopped discussing the launch details with me directly and started routing everything through Delphine for efficiency. I should have known when my own head of communications began CCing Delphine on emails meant for me. I should have known 100 times, in 100 small ways, and I didn't, because believing your husband is quietly building a case to replace you requires a kind of suspicion that no one teaches you how to carry gracefully. It requires becoming, in your own home, a detective investigating the person who is supposed to be your safest place. But 3 months before the launch, I found the emerald stud under his pillow while changing the sheets myself, because our housekeeper was out sick that week, and some habits from Sunnyside never leave you. I didn't confront him. I labeled the evidence, the way my mother taught me, quietly, precisely, without wasted motion. And I began, for the first time in my adult life, to build something that had nothing to do with love. I began to build a case. Once you start looking for a pattern, you cannot stop seeing it. And the worst part is realizing how long it had been sitting in plain sight, disguised as ordinary marital friction. I think often about a specific industry gala at the Frick, roughly a year before the launch, because it was the first time I felt the ground shift beneath me in a way I couldn't rationalize away by morning. Weston had told me he had a late client call and wouldn't be attending, so I went alone, made small talk with our licensing partners, admired the collection on loan from a private European estate, and left slightly early with a headache I blamed on the wine. The next morning, a friend from a rival house sent me a photograph from the same event, taken well after I'd left. Weston, in a tuxedo he hadn't been wearing when he supposedly left for his call, standing close to Delphine near the museum's garden court, her hand resting on his forearm in a way that read, even through a stranger's phone camera, as entirely too familiar for a professional consultant and her client's husband. When I asked him about it, he told me, without missing a beat, that Delphine had needed a ride and he'd stopped by briefly on his way home from the call. He seemed almost bored by the question, the specific boredom of a man confident his wife would rather believe him than face what believing otherwise might cost her. I chose that morning to believe him. I understand now that this choice, made quietly, almost unconsciously, dozens of times over that year, was its own kind of complicity, not in his betrayal, but in my own slow erasure. Every time I accepted an explanation that didn't quite fit, rather than pull the thread further, I was teaching him, without meaning to, exactly how much he could get away with. The comment about being good with details wasn't new. He'd said some version of it for at least 2 years, always in private, always softened with a laugh so it landed as affectionate rather than diminishing. "You're the heart of this thing," he'd say, "but I'm the one who has to sell it to people who don't understand hearts." I used to nod along, grateful, in the specific way you're grateful to someone who convinces you your own skill is secondary to theirs. It escalated in ways so gradual I could chart them now like a slow fever. He started correcting my sentences mid-meeting, not with malice exactly, but with the casual confidence of a man certain the room would side with him over me. When our head buyer from a department store in Chicago asked a direct question about the fall collection's inspiration, Weston answered before I could open my mouth, describing my own mother's sewing machine, my own grief, my own 11 years of struggle, as though he had lived them instead of me. I watched Delphine watch him do it. She never looked surprised. She looked like a woman confirming something she already suspected, that the throne in this particular kingdom was more available than its current occupant realized. She began showing up to meetings she had no reason to attend, packaging discussions, supplier calls, a tense negotiation with our Milan factory over a delayed shipment that had nothing to do with brand consulting and everything to do with logistics she had no training in. When I raised it with Weston privately, he told me I was being territorial. He used that word, territorial, like it was an accusation, like protecting the company my mother died building was a character flaw I needed to work on. I started keeping a private folder on my personal laptop, the one Weston had never bothered to learn the password to, because he'd never imagined I'd need to hide anything from him. I saved screenshots. I saved calendar invites Delphine had been added to without my approval. I saved a voice memo, recorded almost by accident, of Weston telling a junior publicist that Marlowe built the foundation, but Delphine understands where the house needs to go next. A sentence that, played back at 2 a.m. in my empty kitchen, felt like watching my own eulogy delivered by the man who'd promised to love me until one of us died. The gaslighting, when I look back on it now, was almost elegant in its construction. He never denied being close to Delphine. He simply reframed every instance of closeness as professional necessity, and every instance of my discomfort as insecurity. "You used to trust my judgment," he'd say, when I questioned why she'd been given a company credit card. "I don't recognize you when you get like this," he'd say, when I asked why she'd been photographed at an industry gala I hadn't been invited to, standing beside him in a dress from our own upcoming collection, a collection that hadn't been publicly unveiled yet. That last detail haunted me for weeks before I understood its full weight. She was wearing pieces from a collection that didn't exist publicly, which meant either Weston had leaked design files to her directly, or she'd had access to our design server in a way no outside consultant should have had. I asked our IT director, a quiet, careful man named Desmond, who had been with the company since our second year, to pull the access logs without telling anyone why. It took him 4 days to bring me the report, and when he did, he asked to speak somewhere private, away from the open floor plan of our offices on Green Street. Delphine's login credentials had accessed our design server 41 times in the past 3 months, always after 11 at night, always from an IP address that traced back to an apartment in Tribeca that was not, according to public records, her registered residence. It was Weston's apartment, the one he told me he kept for client meetings that run late, a phrase I had accepted for years, with the specific gullibility of a woman who has decided that questioning her husband is more painful than trusting him. I didn't cry when Desmond told me. I thanked him, asked him to keep the report secure, and asked him one more question before he left my office, whether he could tell me, with certainty, if any financial systems had been accessed alongside the design files. He came back 2 days later, visibly uncomfortable, and told me our vendor payment portal had also seen unusual activity. A new vendor had been added 8 months earlier, a company called Larkfield Creative Consulting, registered in Delaware, receiving quarterly payments of $42,000 for brand strategy services that had never once crossed my desk for approval, despite my signature, a signature I did not recognize as my own, appearing on the original vendor agreement. That was the moment the fever broke into something colder and infinitely more useful than heartbreak. I stopped being a wife investigating a husband. I became a founder investigating a threat to her company, and the second identity, it turned out, was one I understood far better than the first. I called Coral first, my publicist, the only person besides Desmond who I trusted completely. She didn't gasp or comfort me the way I half expected. She simply asked, "What do you need from me first?" And I felt, for the first time in months, like I was standing on solid ground instead of a staircase that kept dissolving under my feet. I needed a lawyer who understood corporate fraud better than family law. I needed a forensic accountant. And I needed, eventually, capital significant enough to survive whatever war Weston and Delphine were quietly preparing to wage against my ownership stake. Because by then, I understood clearly that the vendor agreement, the falsified signature, the quiet redirection of company funds was not an affair complicating a marriage. It was a hostile takeover wearing the disguise of a love story. Coral was the one who first mentioned Cassian Voss's name 3 weeks before I actually called him. She'd worked with his communications team years earlier during a completely unrelated crisis at another company, and she remembered, with the specific clarity publicists have for powerful people, that Weston had once called Cassian a shark who thinks empathy is a market inefficiency at a dinner party meant as an insult. I remembered that dinner too. I remembered thinking at the time that Weston sounded frightened of him in a way he wasn't frightened of anyone else in our industry. That was reason enough to make the call. The red flags, once I finally allowed myself to count them, numbered in the dozens, stretching back further than I wanted to admit. The way he'd slowly taken credit for decisions that were mine. The way he'd introduced doubt about my instincts in rooms where I couldn't defend myself without seeming difficult. The way Delphine had been positioned, meeting by meeting, credential by credential, as indispensable to a house she had contributed nothing to building. There was a particular evening, about 5 weeks before the launch, that I keep returning to whenever I try to explain to myself how I let it go on as long as I did. Weston had invited a small group of investors to the apartment for dinner. The Tribeca one, the one I now understood doubled as something else entirely. And Delphine had been seated, without any explanation offered to me beforehand, directly across from him at a table I had set myself that morning. She spoke about the brand's next chapter, with the fluency of someone reciting lines she had rehearsed, and every time she used the word "we," I watched the investors nod along as though the pronoun had always included her. Weston didn't correct it, not once, across 3 courses and 2 bottles of wine. I sat at the head of the table, in my own home that wasn't quite my home anymore, refilling water glasses like the help. And I remember thinking, with a kind of cold, clear detachment that frightened me even as I felt it, this is what it looks like when someone builds a case for your removal in real time and calls it dinner. Afterward, when the guests had gone and Weston had fallen asleep with the particular ease of a man who sleeps well because he has convinced himself he's done nothing wrong, I sat in the bathroom with the door locked and made a list on the back of a receipt. Every sentence from that dinner where I had quietly become we, every glance Delphine had exchanged with him that lasted a half-second too long. It was the first time I let myself write anything down instead of simply absorbing it, and something about seeing the pattern in my own handwriting made it impossible to unsee again. I began noticing things I had trained myself for years not to notice. The way Delphine's calendar invites started appearing on my own assistant's schedule before mine. The way our head of PR, a loyal woman named Fenella, who had been with the company since our second year, began looking at me with a kind of careful pity whenever Delphine's name came up, as though she knew something she didn't have the courage to say aloud. I finally cornered her in the stairwell one evening in April, and she told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she'd been asked twice in the last month to loop Delphine into press materials before they came to me for approval. "I didn't think it was my place," Fenella said, and I could hear, underneath the apology, the specific guilt of someone who had watched a slow erosion happen and hadn't known how to name it until it was already well underway. I understood, staring at Desmond's access logs at midnight in my own office, surrounded by fabric swatches for a collection I might not get to finish under my own name, that the man I married had spent 3 years quietly convincing an entire industry that my mother's legacy belonged to him. And for the first time since the Emerald Stud, I felt something sharper than grief. I felt ready. If you're rooting for her like I am, show it by hitting like on this video. And if you want more mini novellas like this one, subscribe, because there's a lot more coming. Cassian Voss did not have an office in the traditional sense. He had a floor of a building on Park Avenue that felt less like a workplace and more like a vault. Quiet, climate-controlled, guarded by a receptionist who didn't ask my name because she already knew it before I said it. He was younger than the reputation suggested, maybe 45, with the specific stillness of a man who had learned long ago that panic is a luxury he could no longer afford to display. I handed him the folder Desmond and I had built, vendor agreements, access logs, the forged signature analysis our new forensic accountant had already flagged within an hour of reviewing it, and I watched him read every page without a single change in his expression. "This isn't a divorce anymore," he finally said, closing the folder with a precision that felt almost surgical. "This is an acquisition." He explained it to me plainly, the way I imagine he explained things to boardrooms full of men twice his age, who had learned to fear his calm more than anyone else's temper. Weston and Delphine were not simply having an affair. They were building a paper trail designed to justify diluting my founding shares under the language of operational restructuring, positioning Delphine as an essential creative partner whose contributions would eventually justify equity of her own. Equity that would come directly out of my controlling stake. The forged board resolution was the centerpiece. If it went unchallenged long enough, if enough investors began believing the narrative that Delphine was integral to the brand's next chapter, Weston could eventually call a vote to formalize what he'd already been rehearsing in every press interview for the past year. My quiet demotion from founder to consultant, my name shrinking, paragraph by paragraph, until it disappeared from my own company's history. Cassian offered to buy out enough of the minority shareholders to give me, combined with my founding stake, an unbreakable controlling majority before the launch. In exchange, he wanted a board seat and a modest equity position of his own, a deal so favorable to me, so clearly designed to protect rather than exploit, that I almost didn't trust it until my new attorney, a formidable woman named Priya Ashwood, who had spent a decade prosecuting financial fraud before going into corporate defense, reviewed every clause and told me, flatly, sign it before he changes his mind. I signed it in 9 days. Priya Ashwood's office became the second home I never told Weston about. Twice a week, I'd tell him I was at fittings for the launch, which was true, technically, since our meetings often ran directly before or after actual fittings, and instead spend 2 hours in a conference room on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown, going through documents with a forensic accountant named Sadiq Rahman, who had a gift for explaining fraud the way a good teacher explains math to a student who's convinced herself she's bad at it. Sadiq was the one who first showed me the full architecture of what Weston had built. Larkfield Creative Consulting wasn't a single shell company. It was 3, nested inside each other like a set of Matryoshka dolls, each one making the money harder to trace back to a single signatory. The quarterly payments, $42,000 at a time, had been running for nearly 2 years by the time we uncovered them, adding up to just under $1.5 million diverted from Ashdown House's own operating budget, dressed up as brand strategy fees for work that existed almost entirely on paper. "He's careful," Sadiq told me one evening, sliding a printout across the table. "But careful people make one mistake eventually, because they start to believe their own caution makes them invisible." The mistake, in Weston's case, was reusing a template. The forged board resolution diluting my founding shares had been built from the same document formatting, the same footer language, the same autosave timestamp pattern as 3 other filings he'd created legitimately over the years, meaning our system had a complete, time-stamped history of every version of the document, including the draft where his own signature appeared beside a version of mine that Priya's handwriting expert would later confirm, under oath if it ever came to that, was not authentic. I remember sitting in that conference room, looking at my own forged signature on a page that would have quietly stripped me of control over everything my mother had built, and feeling a strange, cold clarity replace whatever softness I still had left for him. It wasn't rage exactly. Rage would come later, briefly, and burn itself out quickly. What I felt in that room was something closer to recognition, the specific, sobering recognition of finally seeing a person exactly as they are, instead of as you've spent years convincing yourself they might become. What followed was the strangest month of my life, living 2 entirely separate existences under the same roof. By day, I smiled through fittings with Weston and Delphine both in the room, approving final looks for the launch, nodding along as Delphine suggested changes to pieces my mother would have recognized instantly as her own handswork. By night, Priya's team and Cassian's forensic accountants worked through records with the quiet relentlessness of people building a case they knew they would eventually win. We found the shell company's full ownership structure. Larkfield Creative Consulting traced back, through 2 intermediary LLCs, to an account Weston controlled personally. We found the forged resolution's origin, a template pulled from our own legal files, edited on Weston's personal laptop at 1:47 in the morning, 6 days after I'd found the emerald stud under his pillow. And we found the messages. Delphine's phone had been backed up automatically to a cloud account linked to her company email, a mistake so careless it almost felt like a gift. In them, she called me, in her own words, the sad little seamstress playing founder, in a message sent to a friend 3 weeks after she'd first sat in my chair. In another, she told Weston, "She'll never see it coming. She trusts you too much to imagine you'd actually do this." I read that last one at 2 in the morning, alone in my kitchen, and instead of the tears I expected, I laughed, quiet, private, and completely without humor, because a seamstress, more than anyone else on earth, knows exactly where to cut. The launch approached with the specific, surreal calm of a storm you can already see forming on the horizon. Weston, oblivious to everything happening beneath the surface of our shared life, grew more confident by the week, giving interviews that inched closer and closer to declaring Delphine's centrality to the brand's future. He told one magazine that Ashdown House's next chapter would be about softness, femininity, a kind of vision that requires a different kind of muse than the one who built the foundation. He was, without realizing it, writing his own downfall into every printed page. I spent those final weeks doing something I hadn't done in years, sitting alone in the atelier late at night, hand-stitching a detail into the finale gown of the launch collection that no one but me would understand. A small line of thread, in midnight orchid, spelling my mother's initials into the inside seam where only I would ever see it. Desmond, the IT director whose quiet diligence had cracked the case open in the first place, asked to be part of the final plan as well, and I said yes without hesitation. He was the one who suggested we not simply expose the affair or the forged resolution in isolation, but build a single continuous narrative. My mother's history first, then the timeline of the company's true ownership, then, only at the very end, the evidence of fraud, so that the room would understand the full weight of what had been stolen before they understood exactly how it had been stolen. People forgive scandal, he told me. They don't forgive erasure, once they see it clearly enough. Cassian and I planned the reveal together, down to the smallest detail, over the course of 3 quiet dinners that had nothing romantic about them and everything to do with precision. He suggested the video. I supplied the archive, photographs I'd kept in a fireproof box since my mother's death, images of her at the sewing machine in Sunnyside, invoices from the earliest days of the business, the original trademark filing with her name listed as sole applicant, dated 4 years before Weston and I had ever met. We agreed on a signal, a single raised finger, nothing more, nothing that could be noticed by anyone in the room except the one technical director we'd brought fully into our confidence. The night of the launch, I stood backstage in the champagne silk gown with black diamonds along the spine, watching Delphine adjust her dress in the mirror beside me, my color on her body, and I felt nothing but a strange, settled calm. The calm of a woman who has already won a war the other side doesn't yet know has been declared. Weston found me for a moment before we walked out, straightened his cufflinks, and said, without any apparent irony, "Just smile tonight, Marlowe, for the company." I smiled at him then, fully, for what I already understood would be the last time I ever smiled at him with any warmth behind it at all. "I always do what's best for the company," I told him. He had no idea how true that sentence was about to become. There was a moment, 2 nights before the launch, when I almost lost my nerve entirely. I was alone in the atelier past midnight, finishing the hand-stitched detail on the finale gown, and Weston texted me from the other room to ask if I was coming to bed. I stared at that message for a long time. Coming to bed? 4 ordinary words from a man who still had no idea his entire world was about to be dismantled by the woman he'd spent a year quietly writing out of her own history. And I felt, underneath the resolve, a grief so specific it nearly buckled me. I had loved him. That was the part no forensic accountant's report could ever account for, the part Priya's carefully worded legal strategy couldn't touch. Somewhere underneath the fury was the simple, unbearable fact that I had once believed we were building something together, and the man capable of that tenderness and the man capable of forging my signature had somehow always been the same person. I called Cassian instead of answering the text. He picked up on the second ring, even though it was nearly 1 a.m, and he didn't offer comfort, exactly, because that had never been his currency. He asked me a single question. "Do you still believe this company is yours?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it more fully than I had meant anything in a decade. "Then nothing else matters tonight," he said, "except finishing that stitch." I went back to the gown. I finished the seam. And somewhere in that small, precise act, thread through fabric through my own steady hands, the same motion my mother had made 10,000 times in a cold apartment in Sunnyside, I found the last piece of certainty I needed to walk into that ballroom 2 nights later without a single visible tremor. The Rainbow Room holds memory in its walls the way certain places do. Decades of launches, engagements, retirements, all folded into the same gold light and the same view of a city that has seen everything and judged very little of it. It seemed fitting, somehow, that the end of my marriage and the true beginning of my company would happen under the same chandeliers, where my mother, decades earlier, had once altered a debutante's gown backstage for a party she was never invited to attend as a guest. I stood 18 feet from Weston as he handed my company to his mistress in front of 600 witnesses, and I lifted one finger. The screens went black. The photograph of my mother at her sewing machine filled the ballroom wall, her face calm, her hands steady, the caption reading simply, Eleanor Ashdown, 1979. Weston turned to me so fast his microphone scraped his lapel. "That's not the cue," he said sharply, before catching himself, aware suddenly of how many phones were already raised, already recording. My voice came through the speakers next, calm and clear, recorded 3 nights earlier in the quiet of my own office. Before Ashdown House was a luxury label, it was one woman, embroidering other people's names onto other people's clothes, in an apartment with no elevator, because no one would give her the chance to put her own name on anything. The room stopped breathing. The video moved through the archive we'd built, early sketches in my mother's handwriting, invoices from a fabric supplier in the garment district who'd extended her credit when no bank would, the original trademark application, her name alone at the bottom, dated years before Weston had ever entered either of our lives. Then a photograph of me at 19, standing beside her casket in a coat I'd made from the last bolt of black wool she ever bought. Someone near the front gasped audibly. I didn't look to see who. The video showed my first studio, peeling paint, a single machine, fabric scattered across a concrete floor, the exact opposite of the polished showroom 600 people were currently standing inside. Weston tried to laugh. It came out thin, strained, wrong. "This is sentimental marketing," he said into the microphone, an attempt at command that landed as exactly what it was, a man watching the floor disappear beneath him in real time. Nobody laughed with him. The video continued. The first Ashdown coat, constructed from my mother's own black wool cape. The first trademark filing. The second filing, 3 years later, still under her name alone, a full decade before Weston's name appeared on any company document. I watched him read the dates as they appeared, his eyes moving faster, his face losing color by visible degrees, understanding, perhaps for the first time in his life, that a timeline does not bend simply because you've convinced a room to believe your version of it. Delphine reached for his arm. He pulled away without looking at her, and that small motion told the room more than any confession could have. His muse was becoming a liability in real time, and he knew it. My voice continued, steady, over the speakers. This house was not built by the man standing on this stage. A murmur moved through the ballroom like wind through wheat. Weston started toward the AV booth. "Stop the video," he ordered, his voice cracking on the second word. Nobody moved. Not the technical director. Not the staff. Not a single person in that room, because by then, everyone understood exactly what they were witnessing, and no one wanted to be the person who looked away before the ending. The next image on the screen was not a photograph. It was an email dated 14 months earlier from Weston's personal account to Delphine's, the subject line reading, in his own words, "Once she's out, we restructure everything under the Larkfield umbrella. She'll never see the resolution coming." 600 phones captured that email in real time. I watched with a stillness that surprised even me, as an industry that had spent a year quietly wondering whether I still had real vision watched my husband's own words confirm, in writing, that the entire narrative had been a deliberate campaign to erase me from a legacy that had never belonged to him in the first place. Cassian stepped onto the stage, then, not dramatically, simply walking up the 3 low steps with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done far harder things in far more hostile rooms. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "As of tonight," he said, addressing the room rather than Weston directly, "the board has voted to reaffirm Marlowe Ashdown as sole controlling owner and creative director of Ashdown House. Mr. Ashdown Cole's shares are currently under review pending a full forensic audit of the vendor agreements bearing his signature." He paused, letting the room absorb it fully. "Ms. Rourke's consulting contract has been terminated, effective immediately." Weston opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. Delphine's face, so composed all evening, finally cracked into something unguarded. Not grief exactly, but the specific panic of a woman realizing the throne she'd been so carefully climbing toward had just been revealed as never having existed to begin with. I walked to the microphone myself then, my heels steady against the stage, the black diamonds along my spine catching the light exactly the way I designed them to. I looked out at 600 people, some of whom had whispered about me an hour earlier, some of whom had already begun, visibly, to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the quiet woman who'd stood 18 feet from her husband's humiliation without flinching. "My mother spent 22 years making other people's dreams real with her hands," I said, "and she never once got to stand on a stage like this one. Tonight isn't about revenge. It's about putting her name back where it always belonged." I didn't look at Weston again. Not once. Not when security walked him quietly toward a side exit 20 minutes later, still arguing with Priya's associate about a lawsuit he no longer had standing to file. Not when Delphine left through the same door without a single reporter chasing her, because a muse, it turns out, is only interesting for as long as someone else insists she matters. The months that followed were not soft ones. Rebuilding a company's public narrative while quietly dissolving a marriage is not the triumphant montage people imagine when they hear stories like mine told years later at dinner parties. There were nights I sat alone in the atelier long after everyone had gone home, running my fingers over my mother's original sewing machine, which I'd had restored and placed in the center of our new flagship as a permanent installation, wondering whether I'd ever fully separate the grief of losing a marriage from the relief of finally, completely, owning my own name again. But I never once considered going back. Not when Weston sent the long, carefully worded email 8 months later, full of language about growth and mistakes and second chances. Not when a mutual friend mentioned, gently, that he seemed to genuinely regret it. Regret, I've learned, is not the same thing as the years someone spent quietly rewriting your legacy while calling it love. The red flags had always been there. The corrections and meetings that trained everyone in the room to trust his version of events over mine. The slow redirection of credit, meeting by meeting, until an entire industry believed the wrong person had built the thing I'd bled for since I was 19 years old. The specific patient cruelty of a man convincing a woman that protecting her own legacy makes her difficult, territorial, insecure. I see it all clearly now, the way you only ever see a staircase completely once you've reached solid ground at the bottom of it. There was a strange, quiet Tuesday about 4 months after the launch when I realized the fear was finally gone. I was walking through the Green Street flagship before opening hours, coffee in hand, watching the morning light move across the restored sewing machine we'd installed at the center of the shop floor. And I understood, with no drama attached to the realization at all, that I hadn't thought about Weston once that entire week. Not with anger, not with longing, simply not at all. Grief, I've come to understand, doesn't announce its own ending. It just quietly stops being the loudest thing in the room, and one day you notice the silence where it used to live. Delphine, for what it's worth, resurfaced 8 months later at a much smaller company, in a role with considerably less visibility, and I felt nothing when I heard about it beyond a distant, almost clinical curiosity about whether she'd learned anything at all from the experience. I suspect she hadn't. Women like her rarely do, because the lesson was never available to someone who mistook proximity to someone else's legacy for a legacy of her own. Cassian remains on the board, precisely as useful and precisely as unsentimental as he was the day I first walked into his office with a folder full of proof. We have never once discussed that year outside the language of business, and I've come to respect that about him more than almost anything else. He never once asked me to perform gratitude, never once made my survival into a story about his generosity. He simply did the work, took his agreed share, and let the rest belong entirely to me. Ashdown House is larger today than it ever was under his shadow. My mother's name sits, finally, exactly where it always belonged. Not buried in a second paragraph, not diluted into vague language about creative input, but carved into the wall of our flagship in the same steady handwriting she used on every pattern she ever cut. The divorce itself was almost anticlimactic by comparison, a slow administrative unwinding handled mostly by attorneys, because the real battle, the one over the company, over the name, over the legacy, had already been decided the night the lights went dark in the Rainbow Room. Weston kept the Tribeca apartment. I kept everything that mattered. I think about my mother often, still, more now than I did in the years before the launch, strangely enough. I think about the specific dignity of a woman who never once had a stage like the one I finally stood on, who spent her entire working life making other women look beautiful in rooms she would never be invited to enter as a guest. I used to believe that reclaiming her name publicly was something I owed her. I understand now that it was something I owed myself, too. The right to stop shrinking inside a story someone else had started writing for me the moment I let him believe my instincts were smaller than his ambition. There's a version of this story where I forgive Weston eventually, where enough time passes that the anger softens into something manageable, maybe even something like peace. I used to think that version was inevitable, the natural endpoint of enough therapy and enough distance. I don't believe that anymore. Peace, I've learned, doesn't require forgiving the person who tried to erase you. It only requires no longer needing anything from them at all. Not an apology, not an explanation, not even the satisfaction of watching them understand what they lost. I have that peace now, and I built it the same way I built everything else that has ever mattered in my life. Quietly, precisely, with my own 2 hands. If you've ever found yourself shrinking in a room you built, if you've ever been told your instincts were merely details while someone else's confidence got called vision, I want you to hear the only lesson that ever mattered to me on that stage. You do not need permission to reclaim what was always yours. You only need one signal.